My name's Brent Toderian. I'm a city planner and urban designer, and I used to be the chief planner for Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And now I am an advisor to cities all over the world. I don't think there's a magic number to how dense a city should be, because I think anytime someone asks me what the right density is, I want to have the conversation about the right design. Because if you design density well, at any scale, at any height, by the way, then it works. So I talk a lot with cities about how to do density well, density done well, I call it. And I think getting the density right through multimodal thinking, emphasizing walking, biking, and transit, emphasizing a very high quality of urban design, and emphasizing a high level of amenity that will actually make the density not only livable but lovable. I think if you do those things well, if you do density well, then you can increase density and quality of life increases. If you do those poorly, then you can increase density and quality of life decreases. So it's not a mathematical exercise, it's a qualitative exercise. We know that if you design a city for cars, it fails for everyone, including drivers. And that's the counterintuitive thing. In many parts of the world, there's this narrative about the war on the car. And if you emphasize walking, biking, and transit, you're somehow attacking drivers. What we actually know is that if you try to build roads wider and wider, they just fill up with more and more traffic. Everyone fights for that finite amount of space with a big car that takes up a lot of space. So we know that's a recipe for failure and disaster. What we also know is that when you emphasize walking, biking, and transit, not balance, but actually prioritize walking, biking, and transit and try to make those things delightful, real options, delightful options for cities, then you move more people, more trips within less space and less public cost, and everybody moves better, including drivers. That's the counterintuitive thing. So it's the opposite of a war on the car, which is this lazy political narrative. What it is actually is cities that work better for everyone, for people. Livability, I think, is a sort of a magic idea that is about quality of life, and it has the bedrocks of things like education and healthcare and a lack of crime and war and strife and civil unrest. So those are the sort of preconditions for livability, but I think livability goes much beyond that to how we enjoy our city. It's about our neighborhood, the quality of our neighborhoods, the quality of our streets, not just as traffic sewers to move cars, but as people places. It's the way you build amenity and beauty and respite from density sometimes into your urban neighborhoods. And so you can do high density living in a way that actually is very livable. And as I say, lovable too, because you can actually have the kinds of surprise and beauty that makes you fall in love with those places too. So I think quality of life and livability, it isn't a mathematical exercise. This is why I roll my eyes when magazines like The Economist try to rank livability. I think the last people I would ask for their advice on livability are economists, ironically. I think livability and quality of life are a lot more, some of it's about what you can count, but a lot of it can't be counted. And there's, again, a qualitative piece to livability, not just a mathematical quantitative piece. In the inner city, in the urban places, it's a challenge of space. It's about moving more people, more trips with less space, and that's all about walking, biking, and transit. But the good news is, because in urban places things are close together, what I call the power of nearness, everything's close, then unless you've done a really bad job with your urban design at eye level and such, chances are it's walkable. Chances are there's at least the potential for transit because you've got density and mix. And hopefully you've got the kind of infrastructure for cycling as well. So the challenge in urban places is a lesser challenge. It's a challenge of infrastructure, it's a challenge of space. In the suburbs, the other context is a much bigger challenge. And unfortunately, much of the world has followed the really negative path of North America in building sprawl, in building suburbs that are not only low density, but also separated. Where everything is car dependent because of the distances and the quality of the experience in between those places, that makes it just logical to think that driving is always the answer. So not only, you might have some tree-lined streets if you're lucky, But the distances between everything are just so massive that it doesn't seem to make much sense. Public transit doesn't run very frequently. Walking and cycling might have infrastructure, but I often say it's infrastructure a long way between nothing and nothing, because in the suburbs there's such massive distances between everything. So the challenge of retrofitting existing suburbs for walking, biking, and transit is not just an infrastructure challenge. You could blow your brains out building infrastructure and nobody will use it, because your fundamental problem is land use. You've built sprawl, you've built low density, separated, segregated uses. And that's very hard to retrofit, extremely hard. So what we say in Vancouver is the best transportation plan is a land use plan. In other words, if you get your land uses right, the transportation is solvable. It's I won't say it's easy, because it still takes creativity and will and hard work, but it's solvable. Whereas if you've gotten your land use wrong, which we did in a lot of our North American and international suburbs, then you fundamentally have to kind of try to transform, retrofit suburbia, which is a new thing we've been talking about an awful lot in North America. And let's not kid ourselves, it's incredibly hard. It's hard physically, it's really hard politically, because a lot of those suburbs, the people who live in them and the politicians that run them, don't want to change. And they're getting subsidized by the inner city. They're paying lower taxes. They have greater access to infrastructure, and they pay less. So why would they want to change? Because even the financial instruments benefit them. So it's incredibly hard to retrofit suburbia and sprawl. The most important thing we can do is at least stop building that kind of suburb. I don't think suburbs are going to go away, but we can build smarter suburbs. We should stop on a dime building sprawl, and we can be building smarter suburbia that yes, the car is there, but it's not the only choice, the only attractive option. That walking, biking, and transit, the mixed-use town centers, the kind of not only land use but transportation infrastructure that makes at least options available. We can do that. We know how to do smarter suburbs. We're just not, largely because of market momentum, sometimes a lack of political will, etc. We're just not. So it's the great challenge of our generation, because we've done a good job improving urban places. The great challenge of our generation is to stop sprawl and to start building smarter suburbs, because they're not going away, but we desperately need them to be better. Here's the challenge. If you build low density suburbia and then you insist that there be a shopping place, no one will build it, because you don't have the density, the population support, the body heat to be able to make that shopping place successful. So the developers won't build it, they won't be able to get tenants. So it's tied to the land use question. So in making smarter suburbs, we have to start concentrating some density to not only make transit work, but to make walkable shopping areas work with enough critical mass around them, enough body heat, a pedestrian shed, ped shed as we call it, where people can walk to shopping and take transit to shopping. And then cities have to insist on it. Because if you give developers the option, but don't require them to build it, often they won't. Not just because they think the market is unsure, untested, but because it might just not be their business model. Maybe that's not what they do. Maybe their bankers don't like that kind of packaging of mortgages or financing. There's all sorts of momentum-based reasons why you have to insist. And the cities that are getting better results are the ones that are insisting on it. If you let the market build what it wants, we're still going to get sprawl. And they might put a little circle on a map that says, here's our mixed-use town center. The funny thing is, all the residential will get built, and that mixed-use town center may never get built. Well, interestingly, I think there's been some studies that have shown free transit can actually have some downsides to it, but it certainly should be affordable. It should be inexpensive. And for the lowest income people, it should probably be free. But it certainly shouldn't be a disincentive to using it. And we're seeing some race to the bottom kind of scenarios where you've got a bad transit system that isn't very efficient, predictable, etc. And it also keeps getting rate hikes because politicians, usually ideological politicians, think it should pay for itself, as if roads pay for themselves. They don't. So there's a lot of political ideology that goes into this issue of how much transit should cost and how much it should pay for itself. It should be cheap, it should be affordable, it should be subsidized, just like every other way of getting around is. But the interesting thing is, when you look at the statistics, transit is subsidized right now less than roads are, than cars are. And yet the narrative is that the roads pay for themselves, but the transit is heavily subsidized. Both are subsidized, but transit is subsidized less. And what we actually find, by the way, is cycling and walking is not only not subsidized because of cost savings for greater, more expensive transportation options and even things like public health, it actually saves the public money every time we walk a kilometer or cycle a kilometer, as opposed to costing the public money, the public purse money to take transit. It costs a bit, and it costs even more every time you drive a kilometer, not just for you, but for everyone, the public, etc. So there's a lot of political baggage, a lot of wrong, flawed narratives about how much mobility costs. And a lot of that is driven by right-wing ideology, frankly. But the math, we have better data on the science of urban mobility than we've ever had before. And so the data is on the side of investment, and that's what it is. It's not a cost, it's an investment in walking, biking, and transit, because it actually either saves us money or in terms of more expensive options, or it just saves us money, period, in terms of saving other public costs, like public health, for example. I'm in favor of congestion charging. I'm in favor of full cost accounting, paying your way, essentially, paying more of what the public costs are. I think a city center congestion charge is a small piece of a larger puzzle that tends to potentially penalize the city center. I would rather take a regional perspective on road tolls and congestion charging, etc. Because the more you drive around, then the more it costs everyone. So as an example, a congestion charge on the center means that some businesses may decide to situate out in the region instead of in the center, so their employees and visitors could avoid the charge, and then they're driving around in the suburbs, filling up roads out in the suburbs. We may just be moving the problem. So yes, I'm in support of those kinds of financial mechanisms. I believe when it comes to carrot and stick, you don't necessarily need a stick or a carrot, but we should get rid of the flawed subsidies we have right now, where there's carrot, stick, and ice cream. We have a system where we're giving car drivers ice cream, essentially. Forget the carrot. We're subsidizing them. We're putting a huge amount of public money into their experience driving and such. And when they complain, we widen roads and widen freeways and such. That's ice cream. If we stop giving them the ice cream and make them pay their way, we don't really need a carrot or a stick. It's just true cost accounting. And I think that's what our system needs. So whether it's congestion pricing in general, whether it's a congestion cost coming into a city center, those are all parts of that puzzle. I like the most holistic approaches possible, because you have to watch out for the law of unforeseen consequences. A financial mechanism that creates a hardship for the city center could lead to office sprawl around a region, for example. The places that are taxing gas or cars or that kind of mobility choice are doing it right. And especially if that kind of taxing goes into funding other alternatives. The irony is, the less people drive, the less funding you have for walking, biking, transit if you tie that mechanism directly, so you can't tie it too directly. But yes, those mechanisms, they're not, let's be really clear, they're not penalizing drivers. They're just not rewarding drivers unfairly anymore. When you do true cost accounting, you see that drivers are being subsidized more than any other way of getting around. So if you add a tax, that's not unfair, that's actually more fair. What's unfair is that the other ways of getting around, the people who are using those other modes, are essentially financially subsidizing drivers. Every place in the world, that financial situation is true. So, and yet, when we talk about a congestion tax or a car tax, it's a war on the car. It's an unfair tax. It's a new tax. No, it's a slight reduction of the unfair subsidy that actually already exists. So the more we can be honest, let's be honest. Let's put all the information out there about what things cost and what different ways of getting around cost or save the public purse. Let's have that conversation and base our systems on that. But whoa, the politicians and the folks who lobby for more car driving don't like that, because then it gets revealed essentially that we've been subsidizing them since the 1960s. If you want people to drive less, and it's not necessarily about car ownership, it's about car driving to begin with, certainly it would help if you actually had true cost accounting, because then people would make rational financial decisions based on how much things actually cost. Right now we're creating a financial incentive for people to drive. It's almost logical to drive. It's cheaper, it's subsidized. So why not do it? So a smart thing would be to have financial mechanisms that get rid of that unfair incentive. But on top of that, you have to make walking, biking, and transit delightful. When I'm working with cities about improving a multimodal city experience, it's not enough to just say, well, we're not going to expand for cars anymore, which most probably do have to say. You have to make walking, biking, and transit at least as attractive or better. And that's a land use situation. When your land uses are right, that goes a long way in making walking, biking, and transit better. And then there's the infrastructure. And then there's the culture, the part of the culture about riding bikes, or how the public perceives riding on a tram, like our Viennese trams here, or taking a bus. There's the whole narrative that some people think that people in suits don't ride buses. Well, they do when it's a great bus system. And buses are the great heroes of the public transit system in many, many cities. So it's the land use, it's the infrastructure, and it's the culture and perception about why it's a measure of success to not have to own a car, as opposed to it being a measure of success to own many of them. We're not necessarily going to get people out of their cars, and that's not necessarily the goal. But if a household that feels the dependency to have 2 or 3 cars can go down to 1 car, if a household that only has 1 car can go car free, not just because of walking, biking, and transit, but because of the growth of something like car share, which is a very important catalyst in getting people from having a car but not using it very often to just being able to get rid of the car, saying, why am I bothering to pay for this car in this parking space when if I need a car, I can use car share in a way. Vancouver, we have the most successful car share program in North America because it's convenient, it's ubiquitous, and people say, why am I bothering to own a car? So your goal can be to reduce the number of trips. Your goal can be by car. Your goal can be to reduce the number of cars and increase the number of car-free households. But if you say to the public, our goal is to get everybody out of their car, people can get quite upset. This is about choice. This is about changing our economic incentives and our cultural incentives and our societal incentives so that people can look at their options and make rational decisions, including the decision to say, I could save my household a lot of money by getting rid of 1 or 2 or all of the cars in our household if there's other options that make sense and are even delightful. Mixed mode commuting is one of the keys to a multimodal city. It's a key to being able to go from a many car household to a few car household or no car household. But alignment between the modes is critical. You need to say, if you're going to ride your bike to a transit station, you need safe cycling infrastructure within the neighborhoods, which often isn't there. And then when you get to the transit station, you either need to be able to bring your bike onto the train, which is a fantastic approach, but many trains don't let you do that. Or they don't let you do it during the heavy commuting times. They only let you do it when the train is relatively empty, which doesn't help if you're trying to get to work that way. So you may need safe bike parking, not just a bike rack there where you could get your bike stolen or rained on or whatever. Safe, secure bike parking. Or, oh, by the way, what many people do in more bike advanced cities is they park their bike there, they take the train, and they have another bike, another of their own bikes waiting for them. In Copenhagen and Amsterdam, it's 5 or 6 bikes per household, and not unusual. Cheap bikes, so that they can be sitting there for a long time waiting for you to make use of them. But the whole point of that is you've got a mechanism for alignment. Can you put your bike in the front of a bus, for example? I'd much rather be able to take the bike onto the bus with a low floor bus, because then it's not just 1 or 2 bikes in the front of a bus, it's many opportunities. So it's all about the multimodal trip hop, where you're starting to perceive, not does the bus take me where I want to go, only. Does the tram take me where I want to go? Does the bike take me where I want to go? And are there hills and safe infrastructure there? But you're starting to be able to say, the bike can get me there, the bus can get me there, the train can get me there, and I don't have to wait a long time between. So the trip can be efficient. The more you have to switch, and the longer you wait at each switch, the less likely people are going to do it, where they say, I'll just get into my car. Especially if there's a message going on out there that there are still going to be widening roads at the same time, so make my car driving experience easier. So to a certain extent, congestion is our friend. The car experience has to be congested, and a car driver has to be able to see that bike lane and say, why aren't I using that bike lane? Or the dedicated bus lane for the bus rapid transit go by and say, boy, I could be on that bus instead of stuck in traffic. So it's about, yes, multimodal trips is an absolutely important part of it, but it's at the same time, it's about what you're not doing, which is making the car experience better. Because frankly, you can't. It's expensive to try to widen lanes, and we know because of the law of congestion, the induced traffic rule, that they just fill up. They relatively quickly fill up within a few years, 50%, and within a few more years, 100%, because it perpetuates sprawl, it perpetuates more driving, fewer, more often trips, longer trips, etc. And it doesn't work. The old saying from Lewis Mumford from the 1950s, we knew way back in the 1950s that adding more lanes to address congestion is like loosening your belt to address obesity. It doesn't work. We knew this back in 1950. And yet we've still been building the assumption into traffic models for decades that if you can solve congestion by widening roads. You can't. But you can spend an awful lot of money wasted trying. Well, culture can change. There's no city I know that culture is to stay the same. And we often say that our city isn't like Amsterdam or Copenhagen. And you have to remember that decades ago, Amsterdam and Copenhagen weren't like Amsterdam and Copenhagen. They were going down the wrong path, like many other European cities, building car infrastructure. And China used to have bikes all the time and then started to build massive car infrastructure and so much smog and congestion that now it's physically unsafe to ride a bike. So we're making cultural choices. We're just making cultural choices in the wrong direction towards the car. So I think changing culture is a combination of perception and reality. You have to make the reality good, or else why would anyone rationally want to choose it? If you want people to walk, bike, and take transit, those experiences have to be great, not just okay, barely adequate, which is what we have in many cities, but they have to be great. Not just the actual efficiency of the system, but the experience of the system too. How people actually feel on it. Do they feel safe? Do they feel appreciated? Both walking, biking, or transit. At the same time, you have to change the perception of it, not just the reality, but the perception, because there's a lot of negative branding out there. Car companies are still spending millions of dollars trying to tell you that riding a bike makes you a loser. That's not helpful. And it's also wrong. Increasingly, being stuck in traffic makes you a loser. But the bike companies aren't spending a lot of money on marketing. So to a certain extent, we have to be working on the branding part of walking, biking, and transit, and why it's important, both for you as an individual, how it can save your household money, a huge amount of money, improve your public health, your family relationships, decrease your likelihood of divorce, it's improve your mental health. It's remarkable, all the things we can now quantify and qualify in terms of the personal experience if you make the choice of walking, biking, and transit. But then there's the societal benefits, whether it's climate change and the incredibly strong connection to the consequences of climate change, public health, etc. All sorts of different higher order public and societal benefits the more we take walking, biking, and transit instead of taking a car. We need to communicate that better, frankly, than we have. And when we're doing all of this, you're changing the brand. You're changing the brand about these choices. You're changing about people feel when they make these choices for society's benefit and for their own personal benefit. But you can't have one with the other. You can't try to sell a bad product through better branding, because people are smarter than that. At the same time, you can have a great product and nobody can know about it. And the incredible pressure from the car companies and such to still stay with the car because of that kind of a marketing can keep you away from making good choices for you. So you really need both. The former mayor of Bogota, who's now the mayor again, Enrique Peñalosa, says that a developed country isn't a place where the poor drive cars. It's where the rich take public transit or live in a city where they can walk to work. That's increasingly a sense of privilege, that you can walk in this great environment and get to work and you're not stuck in traffic like everybody else. So I think there is a mindset shift that's happening about what success looks like. And I think there's two parts of it. One's contextual and one's demographic. Contextual is there are certain cities where getting their driver's license and owning a car is seen as your badge of honor. And there are probably cities where driving is the logical way of getting around because you're kind of stuck without it. So the car equals freedom. That was the narrative for a long time. And the truth is that city probably perpetuates that narrative because it's a car-dependent city. There's other cities, though, where if you can afford a car, you probably don't want to take it out and drive it very often because it's inefficient to use compared to walking, biking, and transit. Vienna, where we are, being an example of that. So it's urban versus suburban, it's multimodal versus car dependent. That context matters to this whole conversation about how the car is perceived, okay? At the same time, you've got the demographic shift. The millennials, no matter where they live, they're coming up with a different perception of car equals freedom. They're not buying that anymore. They realize that that's a kind of a false narrative, it's a bad sales job. And they know that connection equals freedom. And the connection is their smartphone. The connection is technology. And they think of the smartphone in the way that the previous generations thought about the car, as the key to freedom. Whereas the car is just something that if you have to spend a lot of money, takes a lot of your disposable income away as a young person. You're probably a slave to it. And frankly, you got to figure out a place to park once you get there, so you may be driving around the block. Does any of that really sound like freedom? Whereas being able to connect, and by the way, you can't even use your phone while you're driving, or else you'll get a big ticket because you're not supposed to be texting and driving. On the other hand, if they do something else and they use the smartphone and the technology as freedom, then they have lots of choices. And so this whole demographic group has been putting off or avoiding altogether getting their driver's license. They're saying in their early 20s and mid 20s, maybe we'll never get it, or maybe they'll get it once they have kids in their early 30s, if they move out of their parents' basement, the ones that are. There's a measurement that says about half, or a little more than half, the millennials aren't interested in getting a driver's license at all, which is majorly different than any previous generation. Now, let's be clear, that still means about half the millennials do want to get a driver's license. So this isn't a one-size-fits-all scenario, but it does mean that if you combine a changing of the context in cities where more infrastructure is available for walking, biking, and transit, smarter decisions are made, at the same time as this demographic shift with the millennials is happening, these two are feeding each other. And what's happening is that the millennials, which is now the largest demographic group on planet Earth, they were the second largest in history after the baby boomers, but some of the baby boomers, the front end, are starting to pass away. So now we've reached a point where the millennials are the largest demographic group on planet Earth. And cities are competing for them because they're the workforce, they're the creatives, they're the market support for what a city is trying to achieve. So the cities are building more infrastructure for walking, biking, and transit as one of the ways of attracting the millennials. And by the way, suburbs are too, which is one of the reasons why we're starting to get smarter suburbs, because the cities are trying to be places where millennials can stay and start a family, and so they have to be kid friendly. And the suburbs have to be a place where you can do walking, biking, and transit, because that's what the millennials want, at least a certain level of successful walking, biking, and transit, or they won't go. So these two things, the context and the demographics, are working together, they're feeding off each other, and leading towards a different definition of success, which isn't about how fast can I get my driver's license and own a car. It's, can I live in a place where I never need a driver's license and I can put my disposable income into going out with my friends every night, having the coolest technology, and buying a pretty cool bike, which is now my new toy that replaces the car, which was the old toy. Well, again, this is a case where data is our friend. We know that when people are walking, they are socially interacting, not only with their places, their streets, but with each other. And they're more likely just to smile at a passerby than not. And notwithstanding that we have some people with the earbuds in and try to isolate themselves that way, at least you're visually and in some ways interacting with your neighborhood. We also know that cycling is a fairly social thing, as is transit. Sometimes a little too social if you're crammed up against someone's underarm, which has to do with capacity, making sure that you actually have good capacity for transit. But there's the opportunity for social interaction, and even if you choose not to, you're experiencing social connection. You're seeing your neighbors, and you're seeing different kinds of people than you would necessarily self-select. And that's really important for building tolerance and acceptance and familiarity with other cultures and other demographic groups and other income levels, etc. So there's a real mix of people when you're walking, biking, and transit. When you're in your car, you're about as socially isolated as you can get. You're putting on your armor, or you're a turtle going into your shell. And your only interaction is through a windshield or through your side windows. And chances are you've got your radio turned up and you might be listening to a podcast. So you're inward looking. And you're that way all the way to where you're going to go, probably. And you're also, by the way, because your chances are going to be spending more time getting from work to home, you're missing out on some of that family interaction that is your key social base. And we know that there's actual studies that have shown that the longer you commute, the more likely you are to get divorced. So there's a remarkable cost and consequence, socially, family-wise, etc. And even as it relates to your physical and mental health, when you choose to surround yourself in that armor of the car, as opposed to at least having the opportunity to interact with people at eye level, at the speed of a pedestrian or at the speed of a cyclist, or sharing a public transit ride with your neighbors. What a lot of cities are talking about these days is balance, that we can balance walking, biking, and transit and cars. The problem is that's a bit of code for the status quo. It's a bit of a myth that you can balance these things. The car takes up so much more space and is heavier and more dangerous, and you can't. And it's had decades of a head start. So even if your goal was balance, you would have to give walking, biking, and transit a head start for the next 40 years for it to catch up, so you could have balance. But the truth is, the only way you're really going to get multimodal city making is to prioritize. This is the most important word in mobility. You have to prioritize walking, biking, and transit. What we did in Vancouver in the 1990s, after saying no to the freeways, we're the only city in North America where there are no urban freeways coming into the city, famously rejected them in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And that was the most important decision Vancouver ever made in its city making. And everything we've accomplished as a city has flowed out of that decision to say no to the freeways. We built a downtown full of housing, a counterintuitive kind of city making that makes walking, biking, and transit work. So in the 1990s, we said no more car capacity. We're done building space for the car. And in fact, we're going to take away space slowly and strategically and give it to walking, biking, and transit, widening sidewalks, creating public and pedestrian streets, bike lanes, separated bike lanes, critically important, and bus-only transit routes, and bus rapid transit, for example. So prioritization was the key. This was in the 1997 transportation plan, which was a catalyst for, I call it the most important urban design plan we've ever done as a city, even though it's a transportation plan. Because that prioritization, walking first, then cycling, then transit, then goods movement, and then the car prioritized last, it has been the key to all of our multimodal city making. And to be clear, that is not an anti-car message. We don't ban the car. We very rarely have any places where the cars aren't allowed, but we prioritize them last in terms of how we think about our infrastructure, our spatial decisions in the city, and that actually works better for everyone, including drivers. This is what we have proved to other North American cities and even global cities, that when you prioritize in that way, you prioritize cars last, it works better for everyone, including drivers. But if you try to prioritize the car, it fails for everyone, including drivers, because walking, biking, and transit doesn't work, and everybody's trying to drive, so you're all stuck in traffic. So it even fails for drivers. So this prioritization, probably the most important thing you can do in transportation and mobility thinking, emphasizing walking first, biking, transit, goods movement, and then the car. The reason why in our prioritization goods movement is there is it's very important to the economic functioning of the city. So the new challenge these days isn't about moving cars, it's about moving goods. And that's a serious thing to consider, not just in the big sense of trucks, but in the little sense of how people move around in your downtown. You see bike cargo carriers now making deliveries and such. So this is an important part of the equation. I'm very respectful of the issue of goods movement for economically successful cities, more so than I am trying to protect the space for cars. You have to make sure you protect the space for goods movement. But the key is, like in transportation demand management, they don't need to deliver the things all at the same time, and you don't need to necessarily provide the infrastructure for when they want them to be delivered. They have to adjust to being able to provide their goods to the place within a vibrant, exciting city where we're trying to do a lot with our infrastructure. So it may not be a perfect world for them, but it definitely has to be part of the picture of a successful city. When we're doing the prioritization, it's easy to say as a policy, walking, biking, transit in that order. The hard part is the follow through. And what I'm seeing, I'm helping cities develop this kind of reprioritization, this new culture, but I'm reminding them that the truth is in the budget. If you really want to have a sense of the aspirations of a city, don't look to the vision statement, look to the budget. And if you've set this prioritization of walking, biking, and transit, but your budget is still going largely to car infrastructure, then you're still doing the wrong thing. So look to the budget to see the truth about what the real priorities of a city's multimodal thinking